Okay, welcome to another session of Selenium WebDriver. Today we're gonna discuss about a very important topic is page object model or page object design pattern or page object factory. What is all of this, and then how do we use them in our framework, or why we use them? What is the advantage of using them? Okay, so let's discuss all of that right from the beginning. Before we learn any tool in the framework building, or before we utilize any technology, either it is Maven or TestNG, Jenkins, Bitbucket, anything it may be, the first thing I always want you guys to focus is on problem statement, right? What problem statement that technology is solving. And then you see all the answers will automatically start making sense. Whatever the technology is providing you, you'll automatically understand it better if you understand the problem statement at the first place. That is why it is very important for us to understand, okay, what is the problem statement, what is the challenge, and then you will understand why this technology has been introduced, or why everyone is using this technology, or why everyone is leveraging on that. Okay, and then you will slowly understand its value add also. In a similar way, you should also explain in an interviews. Like I always say, if someone asks you any topic, oh, can you tell me why you use TestNG? Your sequence of explaining that should follow the problem statement, the value add, right? These are very important things. Okay, so let's go back to our basics where we started building our tests. So if you remember, whenever we write on WebDriver code, what is the first thing we mainly understood? The page structure, right? The HTML structure. You remember, we designed our own HTML pages, we designed our own HTML elements, right? And why we did that? Because we wanted to understand how the page looks like, or how the page is basically presented to an end user. And then only the next logical step for us to understand those elements and detect them, right? And to detect those elements, we understood different locator strategies. There are 8 to 9 locator strategies: ID, class, XPath, CSS. Within XPath, we did different flavors, traversing ahead, back, so many things. But what was our final agenda of doing that HTML elements? And the final intention was to identify an element, right? Why? Because we want to perform an action on it. Is that clear?
Yeah.
The main focus for an automation engineer is find an element on a web page, perform action on it, right? These are the two basic things which we repeatedly do in our automation scripts. Now, when we find that element, we write something called as, let's say, XPath or CSS, which is locator, right? We use some methods, by dot ID or XPath or something, correct? Now, if you
Yeah.
remember, the problem statement we are focusing here is whenever there are multiple objects on a page. So let's say I have n number of objects on this page. One is text box, one is button, one is drop down, so many objects. Okay. Similarly, I have another page. Let's say one is a login page and next is home page. So this is a login page and this is the home page. Now on this page also, I'll have multiple objects, correct? Okay, I have multiple objects. Now it may be possible that both of these pages are used in a lot of test scripts. Is that possible? That is possible, right? So this subset, what I'm drawing here is our test cases. So test case 1, test case 2, test case 3, test case 4. There could be like n number of test cases, and all of these test cases are using the login page and home page, and login page. So this is your login page and this is your home page. Okay, so what happened when we write it in a plain vanilla way of designing a script? We straight away go create a WebDriver object, driver dot find element by dot ID or by dot XPath, right? And we write it in an individual script. So if I'm dealing with the username, let's say this is a username object or element, I may call, I will write how to detect this username text box in this script separately. If I'm dealing with the same object on another script, another test case, I'll again write by.id and again I'll give the username ID. Third script, again I'll do the same thing, right? So ideally what we are doing is we are writing a same piece of code again and again. Do you agree? At least the way with which identifying that particular element we are writing again and again. If tomorrow some new person joins your team, he is writing his own new test case, and he is also doing everything from scratch. He'll say, hey Saurabh, I am designing one flow, and that's why I'm writing XPath for username, password, login button, and so on. Basically, that is not a good idea, because you are not creating a framework. You remember the coding principles, guidelines, framework definition, right? We create a set of principles, we create a set of standards, we create a set of processes, and we use some technologies, because ultimate goal is to be profitable, ultimate goal is to reusability, minimum maintenance, and more optimized framework. That is the definition of framework. So if you are not doing something which will enhance the maintenance, or sorry, which enhance the reusability of a code, means something you are missing. Now here, the another challenge or another problem statement is, the first problem statement is unnecessary, they are repeating the code. Second problem statement is, if that id changes from, let's say now the username id is abc, you are detecting using abc, tomorrow it changes to xyz. Now you will have to change that id in all your scripts, right? Wherever you are using it, in all these scripts, you will have to go and manually change the definition of that locator, which is again not good in terms of maintenance. This is one challenge. Another challenge, do you think there are some locators which are very weird and it takes like almost a day to understand them and find them and to operate them? Have you faced a situation like this?
Yes.
Maybe, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah, there some kind of locators will behave very weird, and sometimes it will make you frustrated that, hey, whatever I do, it is, this element is not able to recognize or not able to identify, right?
Yeah.
By some or other way, looking at the Stack Overflow, listening to some random YouTube videos, Googling a lot of things, probably a lot of trial and error, you will end to a conclusion and you will find a solution, you will code it, right? Now think about this use case. There is a learning curve involved whenever you get introduced to any new stuff. You pass that learning curve, you understood that. Do you think if some person is dealing with a similar element in your team today, tomorrow, after some time, should use the similar learning curve and have same number of frustration, time, and blocks because he's dealing with the same element? It's not
Yeah.
good, right? You want to create something smooth for him. You want to create something which you already spent on, right? That is
Yeah.
another pain point, which we call it as automation spikes or blockers, where sometimes you get there. Now, to keep all these things in our mind, what some folks has suggested is, hey, why we are writing again and again? Let's do one thing. Basically, ultimately, what we are trying to achieve is identify an element and perform action, right? These are the two important things we do. So what they say
Yeah.
is, let's do identification in a separate file and let's do action on a separate file. Do you get my point?
Yeah.
So what they say is, okay, if we are identifying an object using any strategy, so using identifying and I will say action. So generally where we do action in a test case, ideally, right?
Yeah.
Action on the object, and generally we do that in the test case. But so far identifying is also being happening in a test case so far, right? When we didn't use any design pattern, both of those things were happening in a test case itself. But right now what we are saying is, okay, let's do identification in a separate file. We'll talk about that. And actual performing an action, either click or send keys or whatever you may want to do in a test case. Now what these folks, whoever has come up with this idea, is what they are saying is, if you want to detect, let's say, a username, so write this username identification in a separate file. How you will identify that username object, similarly you do it for all other objects. Okay, so
Yeah.
username and then password and then submit button. I'm just taking one simple example. And then whatever number of tests are you using, so let's say this is my one test, this is my test one, and if I'm using multiple tests, if I'm having 10 different tests, all of these tests, whenever they want to deal with a username, they'll call this file and they'll get the username. They'll call this file, get the username. They'll call this file, get the username. Why this is easy for us now? Because if tomorrow third person in your team is writing another test case, what he'll do? He'll probably write a new test case. He'll not again go and try to identify what strategy I should identify username. He'll look into that file. He'll say, hey, I think this object is being already used in a lot of other places, which means it is reliable. It is working with this strategy, whatever is being written, right? He'll go ahead and consume that. So he's spending less time to automate. Second, he's reusing, which is already been written, right? Third, tomorrow, if you want to do any changes in the username object strategy, if you've done only in this one file, all the test cases which is using that will automatically get updated, which is maintenance aspect of it. Do you agree?
Yep.
How we will do this, we will learn. But now I want you to understand in a logical way, right? Now this file, which I'm saying, generally in a technical words, in an automation language, we call it as object repository. Okay. Object repository or object library, which is a collection of objects. What is library? Library is a collection of something, right? Function library, collection of functions. Object library, collection of objects. Database library, collection of database SQL functions. Then you will see a lot of different names like this in an automation, where people say, hey, this library, that library. So keep one thing in mind. Library is collection of something. Book library is a collection of books. Music library is a collection of music artifacts. Object library is a collection of objects. Function library is a collection of function, and so on. Okay. Okay, so this is the problem statement which we are trying to solve so that we can enhance the usability, maintenance, and of course there are some obvious reasons of spending too much time on something repetitively by multiple members in a team. We can avoid all those things if we have one place where we are putting all our objects. Now again, even if we follow this strategy, do you guys think is it feasible to have one file contain objects of all my applications? Do you remember we discussed about dot property file, right? Which is a very simple and I would say in a way it's a good approach to get started. May not be a good approach to design something big, but in a way it is a good, because we are segregating again actual locators from a test and putting it in a dot property file, right? We learned that in our previous sessions where we used dot property files to fetch something on the go, right?
Yeah.
That is okay. Now here, if we follow this technique, what I'm suggesting is, do you think is it a good idea to have one file which will say object repository and I'll store all my objects on that? Will that be a good strategy? Yes? Yes.
Might be. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you, in your end-to-end automation, average number of screens or pages, how many number of pages will you deal? Just give me a random figure, starting with login page, home page, then you do multiple things. It changes from page to page, right? And every page may have hundreds of objects. Do you agree?
Yeah.
It may have, even though you are not using it, that is fine. But it is possible that that page has hundreds of objects, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So in your end-to-end script, on an average, how many pages you will deal with?
Four or five pages.
4 or 5, okay. Maybe from 4 to, let's say, 10, if it is a complex use case, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if I want to maintain all my objects of this 10 screens or 10 pages in a one file, it is feasible, it is doable. I'm not saying it is not. But now we are talking about scalability all the time, right? We are saying we want to build a project, we want to build a framework where it is scalable, where it can be used 5 years from now also. Now, if you are looking for that objective, and if you are thinking that, okay, there will be hundreds of test cases dealing with a lot of different pages in my application. Now, I'll again ask the same question. Do you still think that having all the objects in one file makes sense?
No, I think multiple files required. I mean, it's
Mhm.
still depend on the project size or the pages. If there is a great number, then definitely we need multiple files.
Okay. Now let me ask you another question. If you are saying we need multiple files, what will be the best logical way to create these multiple files? Again, you have to think the problem statement in mind. We have to increase reusability. So whoever is dealing with similar page or similar object which he feel that already being coded, how he'll search, how he'll identify, what will be the quick mechanism for him to go to an object repository and get the element which he is interested in.
Only thing, so
So
we
uh,
can
create a file on the as a page name, something like that.
Okay, that's a good point.
like object specific repositories we can create like a buttons, text field, date fields kind of.
That is
So
also a good
instead of
approach.
creating a whole,
That is also a good approach. So you are saying based on the type of object you want to create different files, right?
yeah, like a buttons
Right.
might be different buttons that we can create.
Okay.
But if
That's
we create
Mhm. Okay.
a page specific one, we might end up creating the same objects again and again. But if we create the object specific files, we can reuse that in all the pages.
Okay. Maybe possible. Now let me ask you another problem statement. So let's say submit button. Okay. Submit button is available on page 1. Submit button is also available on page 2. Submit button is also available on page 3. Or do you assume, do you think, or do you have guarantee that XPath or ID or whatever you use to identify that submit button will be same in all 3 pages?
No, might be different.
Might be different.
Yep.
And what is the reason? Because the element structure may be different, right?
Elements.
In
Yep.
all the 3 pages, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so at least we understand, or we know that, okay, the submit button, even though they look similar, the identification of those submit buttons on all those 3 pages may differ, right? Now,
Yes.
if you go with your approach, Joseph, where you are saying, let's have an object repository based on type of object, right? So do you
Yep.
think I'll create an object repository for sub button and then I'll have 10 different submits there? And then I'll have different experts. Do you know that will be confusing to an end user that which submit belongs to my page? You're
Yeah.
getting my point?
Yeah. Understand.
It'll be difficult for him to go in that object repository and get the right submit button. Do you agree?
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not saying your approach can't be used. Of course, it can be used, but I'm saying if it has hundreds of submit buttons, because there may be a possibility, right? You will end
Yeah.
up in a confusion. You end up in a chaos, right? So whatever you're trying
Yeah.
to achieve as a maintenance wise or in a reusability wise, probably that will not be able to achieve that goal. Okay, so what is another approach? What the Harshal is suggesting, let's use that. If we create different object repositories based on different pages, let's say. Now, do you
Okay.
think that will somehow help an end user to quickly navigate through which page he is interested in that page, what object he is looking for, something like that?
Yeah.
That will be good.
Yeah.
Do you agree, Divya?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you guys think that this is a more optimized way of looking for object quickly and also provide an end user to reuse it quickly, then you guys are right. This is the same strategy used by the page object model. Okay.
Yeah.
What page object model suggests is don't create one file for all your objects in application. That will keep on growing and growing, and it will grow to a point where you will get like kind of blown out, right?
Yeah.
They do not suggest you to create a separate object repository based on the type of the object, like you suggested, Joseph, because that
Yeah.
is also error prone, right? That is also error
Okay.
prone, or that is also can create chaos in a long term, correct?
Okay.
So what they suggest is create a separate file for each of the pages and store your objects on each of those files. Now the end user, if he's interested in home page, first thing he'll do is home page object repository. In that home page object repository, he'll try to find whatever object he's interested into, correct? Because at least he has a guarantee that whatever object I'm looking for is on the home page screen. Do you agree?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is a more granular and more logical way of segregating your objects rather than putting in one file to multiple files. Fine. So let's say, how do we design it? As I said, page object model, the three things, right? The page word itself defines we are trying to do something page wise, right? Like we discussed now, page wise means every screen wise we're gonna do something. Object, what do you mean? We're gonna create objects for every element. If you guys remember by.id, what we do, consecutive method calls, right? There
Yeah.
we're gonna
Yeah.
create individual objects for individual elements there on each of those pages. Model is something, the strategy, like how we are trying to put all these ideas together. So let's see whatever we have come across. So this is a one page. Similarly, I can have multiple pages on my application. So let's assume we have 3 pages. Now what I'll do is I'll write all the objects in one page. For that page, I'll write all objects on that page. For second page, I'll write all my objects on my third page. And similar thing goes for test cases. So if I have multiple test cases, now what they'll do is, so if this test case needs to use, let me name them. So this is a login page. This is home page. And let's say this is logout page. A very simple example. Now what will happen? When this test case is doing something with a login page, he'll utilize the object from login page. If he's doing something with home page, he'll utilize it from home page. If he's doing something on logout, he'll utilize from the logout page, right? Similarly, all the other test cases. Fine. Now the question comes is, how do we exactly write that? So let's go back to what we're gonna do is, let me close all of this. We'll create a new project altogether. Sorry, new packages. And to whatever we are discussing, we'll try to consume that. So in our project, okay, so here under src test java, okay, or let me put it very simple for you guys. Now under what, Selenium test, let's see the POM file. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll create altogether a new structure for you to understand the page object model. In page object model, the idea is create objects separately, maintain separately, and create test separately. Okay, so same thing we're gonna do. Now what we'll do is in let's say src, in under test, under Selenium starter, let me create under the Ministry of Automation. Or probably I can create under this one. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll create 2 packages. So here I'm saying package object repository, object repo, and I'll say okay, finish. And then I'll create one more package just to hold all our tests. Okay, so here I'm saying tests. Fine. So now under object repository, like I said, what we are planning to do, we are planning to create object repository for individual pages, right? So we're gonna create different class files because they're gonna contain actual code, right? So I'll say class. So I'll say login, and of course we don't need a main because we are gonna use testng. So normal login. Similarly, I'll create another class for homepage. So I'll say homepage. Click finish, and I'll create one more for logout. Okay, I have 3 things now created. Okay. Just a minute. Okay, now for the test. So let's say I'm interested in one test, which is validate login. So this is my one test. I'll write under same test package something validate payslip. I'm just giving any random. And then this is my another test case. Okay, so I have 2 test cases. So let's start with the test case. So whenever we are interested in writing a new test case. How we used to do initially? Let's take copy paste. We used to set the driver and then create a driver object, and then we used to go in that pattern. Do you agree? Correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let me copy any one sample test. So let's say validate login is my test. Now here I'm adding a sample test test ng annotation, and then I'm saying, okay, this is one of my test browser. Let's say login. This is one of my test. Login to application, and then here I'll write whatever code I'm interested into. Correct? Driver dot every whatever the different test we are interested into. Similarly, the same test I can write it in another file, which is another test case. Now here, instead of login to application, let's say validate access. You can have any. The main purpose here is to do granular. Now, if you don't use page object model, how we used to write it? We used to write it web driver equal to new Chrome driver, and then import web driver, okay, and import Chrome driver, okay, and then using this driver instance, we used to do whatever identification, right? Find element by dot, let's say ID, and then give some ID as username, and then perform action here itself. Send keys, Saurav, right? This is our old way of doing it. Now, if you guys remember the consecutive method calls which we learn here, we are calling a find element method. What is the output of find element? You can hover your mouse and see web element, right? Basically, we are passing an input. This is the complete input to a find element. This is the complete input I'm removing. Once you pass this input to a find element, what the find element returns you? A web element object, right? It gives you the element, and on top of that element, you are sending the keys, which is performing an action. Correct? Now, what in a page object model we're going to do is this part, which is basically responsible to identify, right? That part we're going to put it in a separate file, because that's what we are saying, right? By.id, it can be by.xpath or anything. Do you agree with me?
Yes.
Now let's come to the page object model.
Yes.
So here on the login, this is the file where I'm saying, okay, I'll create all my objects under this file. Now, how do we create? Can anyone tell me? Like, just give me a suggestion. How can we do it? Again, you have to think about oops concept here, because we ultimately gonna connect to another class and get something from another class, right? Whenever you want to access another class, what we do? We create an object of a class, right?
Yeah.
And in this case, we're gonna go from test to the object library, isn't it? Because the actual thing which is gonna run is the test, but I'm saying I'm gonna put this part in some other file. So if I want to get that from some other file, what I'll have to do? I'll have to create an object to access this file first, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that we will do it here. Now let's go here. Now what the page object model strategy suggests? We have created, let's say, a class file for a specific page. Now on this page, let me first write a code for you guys, and then I'll talk on that. So first I'll create a web driver instance. Let me import the web driver. I haven't assigned anything to that web driver. It is a blank instance. And now we're gonna create a constructor for this. Okay, I'll talk about that. So I'm gonna say public. How do we create a constructor? Same name as the class name, right?
Class name. Yeah.
And then if I create a constructor like this, it is not needed, because whenever you create a class, Java internally creates a constructor like automatically. It is hidden for you, but it creates. Okay. You guys understand this?
Yeah.
Right? And And the reason for that is because whenever you want to access this class from outside somewhere else, when you want to access that login class, let me close other things so that you guys don't get confused. We'll just talk about one object library and one test. Okay. So when I want to access a login from this file, how we generally do? I'll create an object of this login class, right?
Yep.
How to create an object? Class name.
Object name.
Okay. Equal to
New
new and
object name. Sorry, class name.
and then I'm gonna hover my mouse and then import that, right?
Yeah.
So whatever you do here, guys, even though it looks like a syntax, this is a constructor. Okay, this is a constructor. In a technical word, we are assigning object that, hey, can you please look into this constructor? But okay, if you don't want to go in that detail, this is how. And then once you create an object, you have access of everything. When you say object dot whatever methods in that class file, you will have an access for that. Correct? Now, what I'm saying is, when you want to create a constructor apart from the default one, you will have to parameterize. So this is a default constructor. We no need to write it like this because Java anyway does it internally automatically for you. This is a default constructor. Now we are interested into is a specified constructor where we are passing a WebDriver instance. So here, this is a WebDriver. Sorry, because I'm saying this is a parameterized constructor. Means I want an input to this constructor. What input I want? I want a WebDriver instance. Okay. We will first complete a code and then I'll explain this in a better way. Now, anyone understand about this keyword? This dot driver equal to driver. If I give like this, can anyone explain me what does it mean?
So this class, login class.
See, the color itself indicates there is a local variable inside method, which is this one, which is coming from whoever is calling this method will give an input, right? And this driver is blue color, which is at a class level. So this driver's life is at a class level, and this is given by one who is calling this constructor. Okay. So this is a couple of lines you need to remember, I would say, in to the point where you don't get practiced. But yeah, this is the only setup. That's it. You are good. You have created a constructor and you are passing a driver instance. Why? Because when you run this test, the same driver instance which you created has to access that locators, and that's why you need to pass that driver instance here. That's the only thing you need to keep in mind. Okay. Now whatever driver instance you created in the test, you will pass that driver instance to the class you are trying to access, because using the same driver instance you are interested in doing a location. Now, what we used to write it here inside by dot this, I'm gonna copy and I'm gonna come here and I'm gonna paste it like this directly. Now, what this by.id returns, can anyone tell me? Basically, it creates an object of a by class. Okay. So let's say I'll say by username equal to. This is the right code. Right? We just segregated it. Similarly, I'm gonna do for username, I'm gonna do it for password. I'll say okay, password, and here maybe I can use .id or let's say .xpath I will use. So by .xpath. We are just segregating a code, guys. Okay. So I'm just writing any XPath. Let's assume that this is my password XPath. Fine. Now, if someone is calling this, he's calling this to get the element, right? He's calling that particular object repository to identify, and our final output we want to give that person is the element. So let's say I'm saying I'm creating another method. That method is let's say username, or let us an username. Let's say email. Yeah, because he gonna basically insert an email there, and then fine. And then here, what I'm gonna do is driver dot find element, and then whatever this username by dot. If this is confusing you, I'll tell you some other easy strategy. Now, what this method is gonna return? either void or, but we want to return what? We want to return a web element. So if I'm saying return this particular thing, I'll just try to change. Now this method is returning what? It is identifying this particular element and returning that web element. Do you agree? If this
Yes, sir.
confuses you, let me put it like this. This I think this will not confuse you, right? So if I write a separate methods to just identification and return that element, because ultimate aim of object library is to identify. So here email, and then let's say I'm saying password, whatever, and then find element by ID, and then let's say password. I think these two methods are clear for you guys. It is identifying an element and it is returning, right?
Yep.
Now, this is also a way to write individual methods for individual objects. Okay. Now, if I want to consume this username, then how I should write a test, how I should call that in my actual test. Anyone? Now here, oh, we already created it. Now come back here, create a constructor. It is saying, oh, we already did it. Oh, okay. I think there is some confusion. Fine. Let's save this, and then let's come back. Now here, once I create validate login. Now, once I create a constructor, is there any issue here? Do you guys identify anything? Anyone? Okay, no problem. So now if I do object dot, if I just use email, can anyone tell me what it's gonna give me? Obj.email.
Username.
It will go to the email method of the login class, because we are passing that driver. It will come to the email method. What the email method is doing? Driver dot find element by dot username, right? It is basically trying to identify that element and then returning. What it is returning? Of course, a web element. And then you can perform action here. So if I do like this, dot send keys, will this work? It should work, isn't it? Because ultimately, see what the email method is doing for you guys in a login. This is object repository class, okay? In an object repository, it is coming and calling this method. What this method, is it taking any input? No, because I know this page I'm specifically writing, or you can, rather than saying email, let me put it like this to make it easy for you. So I'm saying, okay, username, and then I'm calling username method. Okay, this method is basically doing the same thing what you used to write it inside driver dot find element, right? And then it is returning a web element, and then in this web element you're good to do next operation, dot send keys dot Saurabh. Do you agree with this? Similarly,
Yes, sir.
now if I want to identify another object, I'll say obj dot password dot send keys, and then I'll say, okay, let's enter password as welcome1. Save it. Now, do you think this is more easy to read for an end user? He'll say, okay, go to
Yeah.
the username. So generally obj shouldn't be like an obj. It should be like, page name. So ideally you should be giving something logical name rather than, so now here it will be look more logical that, okay, page name dot this method and then send keys, right? Now, and in an object library, rather than doing this complete stuff, I am suggesting this because I'll tell you the advantage of doing this. If you write like this and then you pass here, rather than, because we are segregating these three method calls in a simplified version. Now here the advantage is, if this username is used somewhere else on a same page again, then you can utilize it, the same object there as well, while designing your page object, while designing your object repository. Now here That is why what we do is we write all the definitions here. So this is how it will look like. By dot so many different objects, because we are detecting it, assigning to the by, and then finally we are writing individual methods for them to return them. Does this make sense for you? Now
Yeah.
what will happen tomorrow if I want to consume the same objects of a same class, same page? In our case, let's go to our home page. Now if I have another home page, here I want to write another test. So what I'll do, okay, test annotation, let me copy paste. So let's say if I want to deal with the same in my another test, what I'll do is I'll do kind of similar thing. Now here if you see, this will be, let's say, home page. I'm just giving another test in another class, or maybe in the same class also, doesn't matter. Here I'm doing the same thing. So this code is not required now. I'm creating an object of the login class, because this is an object repository, right? Object repo. And then I'm doing exact same thing. Now again, this Saurabh will not be hard coded. If you remember, we can fetch it from Excel sheet or database or property files again, right? Again, we are modularizing it because we want to avoid hard coding of data, and hard coding of the locator paths is generally not recommended within the tests, because tests are supposed to be independent of that. I'll also tell you another advantage. If you follow strategy like this, where your object definitions are completely separate than the script, it is flexible to uptake any new framework quickly. So tomorrow you are learning Cucumber, let's say, which is different, JUnit, NUnit, there are different ways to adopt if you segregate your objects and actual tests. Because now if you are trying to adopt Cucumber, the only thing you will have to do is write a new feature files. There is a separate thing for that, but in that you will ultimately call the same object library, because object library is basically is just detecting an object and giving it to you. That's it. Is this okay? Now
Yes, sir.
when you design your test like this, keeping object repo is separate and tests are separate, this entire thing is called as page object model. Page object design pattern, you can say, because we are ideally, what we are doing is, whatever initially we used to write everything in one script, now we have segregated that to put objects and detection in a separate file and the actual test in a separate file. This mechanism of writing the code in a one specific pattern, we call it as design pattern. It is a design pattern, okay? It's not actually any framework or as such, okay? It is a part of framework. You can say subset, because it's a guideline, it's a standard which you are creating for your team to follow, for maintenance, for reusability, for a better readability. Now, because this test is now more readable, if user reads this find element by dot id, this is kind of confusing for an end user, right? But if he read like this, then it is probably easy for him that, okay, I'm going to login page, I'm using this particular element, and then I'm performing some action on it, right? So if you write it like this is called as page object model. Now another thing is page object factory. Page factory, you may call. It is kind of similar what we are saying, but there is a little bit of difference. So, okay, before I proceed to page factory, this page object model concept makes sense to you? Did you understand?
Yes, sir. Good.
Ultimately, you're gonna run the same test, which is this login test, okay? This is the annotation we're gonna run, because test annotations are not in object library, right? Here we are simply creating some separate small methods to detect and return. That's it. Fine. Now, here I don't want by dot username also. This I'm suggesting, because how this will help is, tomorrow if you want to do some changes in XPath, you have all the XPaths at one place. Here I can use your strategy. You remember, Joseph, you said you want to segregate using type, right? Here I can
Yeah.
say, okay, buttons, and I'll write all buttons, and then here I'll say text box, and then I'll write all text box. Here you can do that. because now on a same page you are again segregating using the type of elements, right?
Yeah.
And then whenever you want to change any XPath tomorrow, if that XPath changes, the navigation for any person is very simple. He'll come to the object repository package, he'll come to that particular page, he will open that class and then see, okay, it is button, go there, modify this, that's it, right?
Yeah.
Fine. So this is the entire discussion is about page object model or page object pattern, you can say. It's a design pattern. This is a very nowadays booming question in an interview to explain page object model. Okay. So whenever you get a question like this, start with a problem statement like we discussed about one pages, one file, if you have multiple files, and then talk about actual approach, what exactly it is, how we segregate the objects and actual test in a separate files. We create separate class files for every pages, and we create separate methods to identify individual object on those pages and put it there. And then in actual test files, we call those, right, by creating a constructor. Why we need a constructor? Because guys, we need to pass the driver, right? The driver which is running in a current context, because that is the driver which uses driver dot find element, right? That is why we need to pass a driver, and that is why we need to create a constructor. So what is a constructor? Basically, in a very simple word, if you guys don't know, constructor is a friend of a class. Whenever you create an object of any class, constructor by default gets executed. You no need to explicitly call constructor to execute. Okay, that is why the constructor is being developed. It is like when you start your car, the lights will automatically be on. It is that kind of thing. So whenever anyone is creating an object of a class, if you see here, if I'm creating an object of a class, whatever the by default constructor is there inside that class will get called. And if you want to call a specific constructor, in this case, we are explicitly passing a driver. So we are saying, okay, please call the parameterized constructor, not the normal constructor. So we are passing a driver object because we want to detect our elements using that driver instance. Now this entire thing, whatever we have designed, is how we write modular tests, right? You can make it more modular by segregating within object library using button and text box and so on. So this is this is all about page object model or page of pattern, you can say. Now another much more value, much more improvised pattern than this is page factory. Now what is the page factory? Now see, like I said, the automation is continuously evolving, and it is changing and getting improvised and adding so and so. So initially when page object model came, people were happy with the overall way it works, and people started adopting, they started translating their projects into page object model. And then when you work on something for a long time, you also realize its downturns, right? You also realize some more challenges. So that is what the continuous improvement is all about. Then people said, hey, we can further improve on page object model by something called as page factory. The test ng people heard this, and then they created an annotations which again simplified your object repository and detection. Now what they did, now I'm explaining you page factory. Okay, the F, you remember F, because whenever you listen factory, you remember that there is something called as find by annotation given by test ng. Okay, now what test ng is doing is, test ng is saying, hey, you know what, you write all these things by dot separately, and then you detect this particular method separately. What if I give you an annotation which will do everything by default for you, and you no need to write the code? What I mean is, let me write it for you guys. So this is our page object model. I'll say POM. So POM is not the Maven POM. Okay, so this is page object model POM. Okay, now here I'm going to start writing same code. Okay, see, the test is not going to be different. Only the way we write it here is going to be different. Now here what it's saying is page factory. Now what page factory tells you is, if you are using a page factory, you have to use something called as find by annotation given by testng. Now what testng says, if you use find by annotation, this is given by testng, so you'll have to import it. Okay, what I'm doing, and then let's assume id equal to whatever that id is. Let's say username, and then basically it returns a web element. So I'll say web element, what I'm trying to return, username. So we're just creating on the fly, that's it. And then here you'll have to import find by. What happened? Import find by from Selenium support. Okay, fine. Now what the page factory is, you no need to do all these things, whatever you're doing. Okay, page object model, you're writing by separately, you're writing separate methods for every element to detect and return, right? They are saying you no need to do all these things, you just write these 2 lines of code and I'll do everything for you.
Wonderful.
So find by annotation, what it will do, internally it implements this page object model. Okay, internally it implements this all these things for you. And what is your final intention? To get the element, right? To detect an element and get the element. So it says, okay, I'll do everything for you, you just tell me what strategy you want to use. You want to use XPath? Okay, just write XPath here. You want to use CSS? Just write CSS here. You want to use ID? You write ID here. So what the page factory will do is, it will try to identify an element using this, and whatever it finds, it will return. This can be any name, you know. Are you getting my point? So this entire page object model code which we have written is no more needed now. This 2 line of code will simply identify that object on the page and return it. Is that simple, the page factory? Are you getting my point?
Yes, sir.
This annotation will identify your object on the page with this strategy and return the web element. That's it. Now, if you want to consume that, the only one caveat or one extra thing you have to do is, you have to create a page factory. Here, when inside a constructor, you have to use page factory dot initialize element, and then you have to pass the driver here, and for the page you pass this instance because you are using the same. That's it. I know this may sound difficult, but this is a reusable, guys. Most of the people just copy paste this. Okay, so we are just using the page factory dot initialize element of this particular driver class, whatever it is passing. See, there are 2 elements which is needed for int. One is your web driver and what the current object page is. So this is the only thing we have to add in our page object model if you have already written a page object model. Now once you do this, you don't need to write this page object. If you don't want to use page object model, if you want to use page factory, which I prefer and I suggest you to, because that is latest and that minimizes the number of code lines, what you need to do, just use find by annotation, whatever strategy you want, write your XPaths, and then just return that web element. Is that simple? Now how do we consume that? So let's say if I'm writing a password, again I'll copy this, I'll say okay, id equal to, or let's say XPath I'm writing. The only thing we are doing here is we are more and more making it modularize. Okay, whatever we learned initially, which we were used to write in a single file, now we are using XPath equal to, can be anything for password. So let's say input tag. I hope you guys didn't forget how to write XPaths, right?
Of course.
Equal to password, right? We spent a lot of time to learn how to write passwords, XPaths. And then here I'm returning password element. You can name anything, just make sure that they are not a duplicate. Am I missing anything? Okay, duplicate name it says. So PSWD it says. Fine. Because I didn't comment that code. So now with this strategy, I'm able to identify a password and return a password. So this is the page factory. Now, how do we consume it? Now let's come back here. This is our test, right? Now we are calling a username method. Initially, we used to call username method because that is how the page object model was all about, correct? Now, can you guys suggest me what we should be doing it? How do we call it? Because now in our this, let me comment this, because let's say if I'm not using page object model, commenting this part, right? I'm using page factory. This is how it's gonna look like, correct? Now, if this is how it's gonna look like, then here, of course, it will throw me an error, right? Now, I want you guys to tell me how I'll call this in my test file. Anyone?
It's not a method.
Okay, let me remove, because this method is no more exist, right? Because that is initially, okay, dot, what else? Any idea? See, what is your intention?
Choose a consecutive method calls to find the element.
Do we need method? First of all, do we need method?
Can you switch that class login?
Okay, so you still need method. I was kind of trying to understand. You still need method because ultimately method is something which you call from outside, right?
Yeah.
Here, even though here it is returning you, or here it is giving you a web element, but this annotation is not a method. So it is not returning anything as such to a calling party. You're getting my point?
Yeah. Okay.
So that is why
Yeah.
you still need method. So what I'm going to do is, let's say this is the same methods. I'm going to copy paste downward here just to show you guys what I'm actually mean. Let me uncomment this. Now here, instead of doing all this stuff, I'm saying return username, because this he already, he has done all those thing for you. He basically find it username and you are just returning it. Do you get this? Or maybe if you want, you can just write it like this, just below that. This is also fine. And then you write it like this, just below this, and you return. Because to return, you need a method. You're getting my point? Why you need a method? Because whoever is trying to pass, whoever is trying to get something from outside world, from outside his own class, he need method. Now, if you carefully look into these two things, what we are avoiding here is writing that driver dot find element by dot id, that line of code, correct?
Yeah.
Here, the annotation is helping you to detect an element and return. In the sense, he's storing that element, whatever it found, and then you need a method to return it. So that's why you're writing a method to return it. And then here, now here, if you come back, the code will be still the same. You don't need to change anything. Only the way you are doing is different. That's it. Generally, in a page factory, you don't write it like this. You basically write all methods at the bottom, and you write your detection strategy up, okay, like this, so that it makes more sense for the update. And because this is not going to change, right? This is going to be all the time, this is going to be similar. So people ignore this fact. This is going to be all the time same because it is just returning it, nothing it's doing. The actual thing is this, which helps you to identify and store your element. So probably this is what you are going to change in the future, and this is called as page factory. They may look little bit similar to you, but when you start practicing it, you will understand the difference. And I personally prefer page factory because it's more easy code and more flexible code. And whereas in a test, And believe me guys, once you have good libraries developed in a project, automation is fairly fast and fairly easy, because you copy paste them most of the times, you reuse.
Okay.
And that is a whole and soul idea of creating automation in a much more modularized way. The way you are detecting elements, the way you are consuming elements, the way you are validating them, the way you are reading a data, try to granularize it as much as possible, of course in a logical way, because that increases reusability, that increases debugging. Debugging becomes very easy, and there are so many other advantages of it. Are you guys following this so far?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let's take a break of 10 minutes and then we'll come back to discuss the another topic. Okay,
Yeah, sure.
cool.